Welcome to our discussion about movies, about films, which are a very American invention. And so we're going to start with our typical frame that anytime we take a look at some kind of new medium that is invented, we take a look at the frame that says that this is a technological innovation that leads to increasing democratization of information as influenced by the role of regulation and the role of the market. So let's see how that applies to the world of film. The technological innovation is obviously the fact that all of a sudden we could capture moving images. We already had newspapers. Newspapers had reached the point where they were able to include photographs that are depictions of reality, but those were static images. Film was the first to be able to take a moving image, originally without sound and then with sound, and be able to show us real life as it unfolds in front of us, or what passes for real life. So you have that technological innovation. And that leads to that increasing democratization of information. Now, again, as we know from the past, that anytime there's a new technological breakthrough, it's very expensive at the beginning. Only the elites have access to the equipment able to produce something like that. The barriers to entry are fairly high. But what we see with film, for example, is that very quickly it was able to become an affordable thing for people to be able to go to the theater. To be able to get access to that new kind of technology. It was so popular. And it is influenced by the role of regulation. We're going to talk about the role of government and how sometimes when government threatens to intervene, the industry itself will decide to self-police in order to avoid letting the government step in. And also the role of the marketplace, how much the marketplace influences what happens and how that new medium develops. So let's start first by taking a look at some of the best films ever. The American Film Institute once put together a list of the top 100 films. They had all of the critics whose work they valued, determine what they thought about this kind of new medium, and what are the best films. And I think you'll be maybe interested in some of the listings, whether you've read them in your book or not yet, or whether you've seen them before online. But stop and think for a moment about the favorite films that you've enjoyed, what kind of genre they come from. Do you like action films? Do you like romantic comedies? Do you like serious dramas? Do you like science fiction? What kinds of movies do you like, and what deserves to be at the top of the list? Now, if we take a look, we'll see that the top 5 films are quite interesting. You see that the number 1 film is Citizen Kane, and I think that's a film that many people talk about, but more people talk about it than have actually seen it. So it'll be interesting to see how many of you have actually seen the film. Citizen Kane, very serious film done by Orson Welles, the boy genius director. Clyde Toland was his cinematographer and art director on the film. What made the film so unique was that we've seen in early films, for example, that they were done in these sort of boxes. Originally, they were done outdoors on the East Coast, where sunlight would stream through. They put it near a beach someplace to try to get some sunlight so that they'd have natural light to be able to. It takes a lot of light to be able to shoot a film in that era when the film was so slow. And so you had these very static-looking boxes in which actors basically transferred their stage plays onto that filmed box where the camera would be on the outside in a static position, just filming what was going on in that set outdoors, trying to get some additional light on the scene there. Well, what Citizen Kane did was realize that what people really wanted was to be able to see reality. That when they looked up at the ceiling, they wanted to see a ceiling there, and they wanted to see shots from below looking above. The cinematography in Citizen Kane, the framing of each shot, that became the standard, where each shot in a movie is carefully positioned and framed when we're talking about Hollywood films with major investments. And Orson Welles was really a genius at this, and it's interesting to see that he wasn't able to sustain that success and get Hollywood to back his additional films. He never really achieved the same kind of success, but he is recognized for the innovations that he had in filmmaking. Second on the list is Casablanca. Play it again, Sam. The scene where Humphrey Bogart says goodbye at the airplane at the end, and we see that it's a great romance. And it's set against World War II, so it has serious action drama along with it. The Godfather, an American classic, Godfather 1 in particular, 2 in many cases, 3 not so much, but Godfather 1, an American classic, crime film. crime film, America, the mafia. We see that it's retranslated into cable TV when The Sopranos come along. Gone with the Wind, all about slavery in the South, a film that has some scenes in it now that kind of make us cringe a bit. I think we see that with many of the early films. Lawrence of Arabia, a sweeping epic. One of the great long films of all time. Again, a film maybe not watched as much, excuse me, not watched as much now as it may have been in an earlier era, but widely acclaimed by the critics. One of the questions, of course, becomes whether the critics have a different view of what's successful compared to what people in the country think is the popular films. The next on the list, Wizard of Oz. Remember, it changes from black and white to Technicolor in the middle. It has music. The Graduate, we see the rise of irreverence and irony. On the Waterfront, very serious film. Elia Kazan does On the Waterfront, very interesting movie. Schindler's List, Steven Spielberg's classic about the Holocaust. And then Singing in the Rain, which is a beautiful dance and movie film with a musical, very much part of that American genre of the musical. So it's interesting to take a look at the top 10 and see how many different genres are represented in what we consider as quality and what the critics consider as quality. If we look at the early films in particular, the way in which those films were brought to people were through what were called Nickelodeons. We had seen there were theaters all across the country that housed vaudeville troupes. Where people wanted entertainment in small towns, a vaudeville troupe would come in, they would go to the local theater, they would put shows on all day and all night, multiple shows during the day. You would spend a small amount of money, you'd be able to go in and you'd watch a song and dance act, you'd watch somebody come out with a chicken. There'd be a dog act, there'd be singing, there'd be dancing, there'd be comedians. It would be a variety of different kinds of entertainment all put into one show. It relied on live actors. If they got sick, if they got held up, they had to feed them, they had to take care of them, they had to pay them individually, there were fights. Anytime you're dealing with humans, that's always a big complication. Well, when movies came in, all of a sudden you could just put up a projector, maybe hire a local pianist to play some music for the silent films to add to the drama, put up a sheet against the wall and start showing those films and charge people a nickel apiece. Nickelodeon, that's what it was named for. And people would stream in and watch these films all day long, and you didn't have the same kind of hassles that you did as you did when you had the vaudeville troupe. So what we saw was the death of vaudeville and the death of burlesque as the Nickelodeons came in and film took over. Take a look at that first feature film, the first feature film ever shown in the United States, ever created in the United States, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. He later did another film called Intolerance. He was a very famous filmmaker. Griffiths is quite interesting because if you take a look at Birth of a Nation, you talk about cringeworthy. There are really revelatory scenes in there that show us what life was like during Reconstruction, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. But instead of being a way of showing the evils of that kind of system, it seemed to glory in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And it really caused, and when we look back now at the history of an awful lot of movies, what we find ourselves is feeling a bit uncomfortable about the kinds of films that were actually there in the beginning that we saw that were part of our movie history that show us how we really are. Now, when we see the first of the movies that have sound, the talkies. We went from silent films to the talkies. We see The Jazz Singer, the first talkie. Al Jolson. If you see that movie poster, that's the kind of thing, again, that will make us cringe today because that is a white man in blackface promoting this movie called The Jazz Singer. Al Jolson used to perform on television, early television at the same time, and you would see him in blackface on occasion. That was a part of the genre of minstrel shows that went around the country, and the movies reflected that kind of racism in the culture. Intentionally or unintentionally, it shows us as we really are, and it captures a moment in history, sometimes making us uncomfortable at the same time. There was another kind of film that lured people into the theaters regularly, and they were the serials. They were the cliffhangers. And the reason they called them cliffhangers is because you'd see somebody like poor old Pauline. One week she'd be tied to the railroad tracks, and the train would be 2 inches away, and the film would stop and say, if you want to find out what happens to her, come see next week. Or she would literally be hanging off the edge of a cliff. She'd be hanging up there by a branch, and that's why it was called a cliffhanger. Of course, when you got there the next week, you realized you had been, I don't know, duped a bit. That train that was 6 inches away was all of a sudden a mile away, so everybody had time to untie her from the tracks. Just as she was sliding on that branch on the cliffhanger there, you found out that there was somebody who already had a hold of her wrist. So those cliffhangers were designed to get people into the seats. That's part of what movies are all about, is trying to get an audience, trying to find commercial success, because without commercial success, this kind of expensive medium is difficult to sustain. As movies evolved, in particular feature films, which are fiction, documentaries are about real life, but fiction films, feature films, we see that they arrange themselves into genres, and many films will cross from one genre to another. But some of the major genres are romance, action films, dramas, comedy, mystery, horror, children's movies, very popular, westerns, sci-fi. Being able to see movies in different genres helps the audience understand whether it's a film that they would like, so they're marketed in that way. Part of the challenge with filmmaking is marketing to get to the right audience so that they show up to see the films that they would like. As films began to evolve, as they had now sound, they were talkies, and they were shown in theaters that were becoming more and more grand. You know, originally just the sheet against the wall was enough, but now that we had talking films, you see these beautiful old theaters with chandeliers. People wanted a night out where they felt it was special. But then the Depression hit, and it was like, ooh, is the film industry going to die? I mean, are people going to be willing to spend even a nickel to go to the theater anymore, to a Nickelodeon, right? Are they going to be willing to spend real money to be able to go to a theater? Well, what you saw during the Depression, for example, was using gimmicks to try to get people into the theater. There was something called Dish Night, right? And typically on a Wednesday night, you would go to the theater, maybe a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, where normally they wouldn't have a whole bunch of people in the audience. What they would do is they would give you, if you bought your ticket, a teacup or a saucer or a salad plate. And different nights would be different dishes. So you would pay your money and you could, over time, acquire a whole set of dishes. But, you know, if you were missing a teacup, you'd have to make sure to go on the night that the teacups were available. So it was a way to assure a certain level of audience, even during tough times. One of the other ways to attract an audience, of course, was to make films alluring and to really make them the kinds of things that people would rush to the theater to see. We even see this in animated cartoons. I was fascinated by the early Betty Boop cartoons. Betty Boop was a young flapper woman of the 20s, and she would go out in the evening. And there were all sorts of references to sex and also to drugs. At one point, they have, I think it's Cab Calloway singing about Betty kicking the gong around. Well, kicking the gong around is a reference to opium. The Chinese who built the railroads on the West Coast introduced opium to the United States. And then there would be opium dens where people would go in and get a pipe of opium and smoke it, and they would feel the effects of the drugs and buy it in that circumstance. And that was, now because we associate the Chinese with hitting the gong, it was called hitting the gong around. There's another phrase in one of the Betty Boop cartoons where they talk about her being cokey, meaning that she takes cocaine. This led to a bit of a backlash. What we see so often with something like film in particular, with any kind of new medium that comes along, is that there's this initial enthusiasm. Everybody has all sorts of great ideas. Artists are doing wonderful creative things with this new genre, this new medium, and pushing the boundaries in many different ways than they ever had the opportunity to do before. And then people go, whoa, wait a minute, we need to pull back from that. That's getting to be a bit too much. We can't have this much open sex and drug references. Even in kids' cartoons, that's getting to be a bit much. What this led to was many ministers and moral reformers and people who were politicians that saw this was a good ticket to run on, saying what we have to do is government has to start intervening in the movie industry and regulating it. They have to start censoring it. After all, if we look back historically, we realize that that First Amendment protection, it protects artistic expression, but it does not protect it at the same level that it does, for example, the free press. Newspapers, because they're political and we want an open democracy, have special protections. Different kinds of artistic expression, however, are more vulnerable to restrictions on the part of government. And what we see, for example, in the case of movies, was that the different states were starting to pass censorship laws and saying you can't do this in a movie, you can't do that, you can't show a woman's breast, you can't have a reference to drugs. A lot of it was built around morality, too, where we don't want you to have the bad guys win in the end, that sends the wrong message to kids. As the government got closer and closer to intervening, Hollywood got scared. The movie industry had moved pretty much from New York, where there wasn't that much sunshine all the time, out to the West Coast in Hollywood, where there was a lot of sun and they could shoot outdoors a lot. So Hollywood had become the center for the movie industry, and they were getting concerned. They didn't want to have to make 50 different versions of a movie, one that would pass the test in Ohio, another one that would pass the test in Alabama, another one that would be okay for New York, which would be much more liberal in what people would be allowed to see. So they could see that the federal government was revving up to passing a nationwide censorship law of some sort. So the movie industry got together and they put as their spokesperson Mr. Hayes, and Mr. Hayes was a former prosecutor. Then they developed their own Hayes Code. And as you can see, it says, no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Big on sin. Correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. This Hayes Code not only reduced the amount of nudity in movies and drug references, but it also meant that the bad guys didn't get to win in the end. You couldn't say that adultery was a good thing, and you couldn't say that crime paid. So there was real pressure on the movie industry to conform, and it was a voluntary association. What we've seen over the years is this evolved into the MPAA code that we see now, where you go and you can see movies, but they are restricted for certain age groups at certain times. One of the challenges for the movie industry is that in the digital era, kids can get their hands on almost anything, so the idea of movie codes may seem a little antiquated now. But they were a way of assuring parents and assuring the public that the movies weren't going to go too far. So some of the other things that you need to know historically about the film industry and about what happened was that it started originally as a star system. Much to the surprise of the movie makers, people liked certain people. Clara Bow was the it girl. Douglas Fairbanks was the swashbuckling hero. Mary Pickford was America's sweetheart. We have all of these early stars, many of whom went on to found their own movie studios. They found out that the public liked certain people, and they just like them. There's something about what comes through the camera that attracts an audience. We see people in this era, who have an automatic star power, that they can bring a certain number of people into the theater just if they're included in the movie. This meant that those stars started to have enormous power. The power originally resided with the movie production companies themselves, because they would put these stars under contract, and they'd put them under these multi-year contracts where they would have control over them for a large segment of their professional life. Well, a lot of the stars began to chafe because maybe they signed a contract when they were in their early 20s and relatively unknown and didn't have much power. But now 5 or 10 years into the contract, somebody like Bette Davis, who got to be very famous, very powerful, discovered that she couldn't break her contract. And it meant that the studio could actually loan her out and force her to do films she didn't want to do, movies that she thought were really wrong for her. But to make money on her, the studios would use her almost, it was viewed as a sort of uncomfortable, almost slave-like situation. So Bette Davis is quite famous for saying, no, not going to do it. And she broke her contract. The Hollywood press went after her, called her difficult, called her temperamental. Her career might have done better financially overall if she hadn't done it, but she helped to break what was called the star system. The idea of the studio system. The studio system, she was really the progenitor of the star system. She realized that the real power resides in the stars, many of whom form their own independent production companies now to be able to produce films and make films that they would like to star in. They want more and more control over their artistic careers. There's 2 other terms you need to know. When movies started out, the distribution was an expensive part of the process. The first part of the expense, of course, was just the making of the film itself, the director paying the actors, getting permission to use the locations, building the sets. The film, the technology itself is expensive, very expensive. But then the other part is, after you have the film, how do people get to see it? Well, there were these distributors who had control of these theaters, many of which were rehabbed from old vaudeville theaters, right? And they were showing films, and they would take a film from, the studio would give them, they would license them to be able to show the films in their theaters. But the studios realized that everybody wanted the blockbusters, but nobody wanted the duds, right? So they weren't going to be willing to pay very much for the duds. Now, in the old days, movie theaters would do things to lure people in, like have double features where you get to see 2 feature films in the evening for the price of 1, that kind of thing. They would put a lot of shorts around them, cartoons and other things. So, excuse me, there was a need for a lot of content. And what the studios began to do was called blind booking and block booking. Blind booking meant, if you want our movies, you have to take whatever we give you. We're not going to tell you in advance what they are, so you don't get a chance to pick and choose. You take them blind. That means you might get Citizen Kane one day, but you're going to get some dud film the next day, but you're going to have to be willing to show both of them and pay for both of them, because we have to find a way to defray the costs on the ones that don't make much money. Now, block booking meant the same kind of thing, that you had to buy a block of films, a specific block of films, and that meant that there were some duds woven in with some of the blockbusters. So what we see was that was another part of the system that the theater owners chafed under, because what they really want to do, what we see now, for example, is a film will open on a Friday, and if it's not doing well enough by Monday, the number of theaters that show that film will decline dramatically. You have to that film has to become a hit almost immediately in order to be able to secure a large number of movie theaters to be seen in the succeeding days. The theater owners have more power now. They can tell the studios more and more which films it is that they're willing to show. And that means that the people who produce the films are looking for other ways to make back their investment. We'll talk about that, about how they'll do international sales, or they'll do DVD sales, or they'll sell it to cable companies and put it up online and make it easily available through something like an instant Amazon Prime or a Hulu, finding other revenue streams to be able to take care of the costs of making these movies. And the Hollywood blockbusters are still expensive films to make. Another important part of film history that you need to know about were the sort of repressive era, the Senator Joseph McCarthy era, the McCarthy era of the 50s, where there was a huge fear in the culture during the Cold War about communism. And it extended to concerns. Again, we see this pendulum go back and forth. Are the movies a source of great American pride and a wonderful inspiration, or are they poisoning our kids' minds? Are they causing problems in the culture? Are they reinforcing the right values or the wrong values? Well, there were concerns in the 1950s that maybe communists had infiltrated the movie industry. What we often see is that creative people tend to, in many cases, be more progressive, more on the liberal side, closer perhaps to the communist philosophies. So there was concern on the part of Senator McCarthy, who began accusing Hollywood of helping to undermine the moral fiber of the country by having movies that were glorifying the kind of communist values. It led to what was called the Hollywood 10. The House Un-American Activities Committee would be bringing people in from Broadway, people in from Hollywood, and they would ask them, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, and do you know people who are? And some of the people who were the screenwriters, maybe their names weren't as well known as stars, and some of the directors decided that they just simply were not going to appear before the committee and say anything. They would exercise their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refuse to testify. They felt it was inappropriate for government to muscle them into giving up names. And 10 Hollywood directors refused to do so and ended up in contempt of the Congress. And for many, it was destroyed their careers. Dalton Trumbo is a very famous writer. He wrote the movie Spartacus. And he had to write under a false name for many years afterwards, just to try to make a living in order to support his family. We had talked earlier about On the Waterfront being on the list of the best movies of all time. It had also been Elia Kazan. It had also been a Broadway play, right? Well, Elia Kazan was one of those who did agree to appear before the committee and name names. And many of his peers held it against him for the rest of his life. In fact, when he received his Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Film Institute, some actors, including Ed Harris, stood up at the award ceremony and turned their backs on the stage because they remained so upset that he had agreed to collude with the government and give them names of people that he thought might have been what were called communist sympathizers. So that was a very big era, and it's a very sort of an important milestone about the courage of the people who are involved in the film industry to be able to stand up to government pressure, not to be willing to cave to government pressure, to stand up for the standards that they cared about. Now, one of the other things we need to think about in a business model for movies is to think about windows. How are movies seen? There are first-run movies. Those are the ones that are seen in the theaters. There used to be second-run theaters. There was an old converted movie house out on M78 here outside of Lansing, where a movie 2 or 3 months later, after it had been shown in the theaters, would be shown for about half price out at that second-run theater. Nowadays, they tend to go to cable. They tend to go to television. It's a different market. But there were second-run theaters. There's international release. There's video pay-per-view. There's premium cable channels and network and non-premium channels. There are all sorts of ways for movies to be seen nowadays. And in a digital era where near-perfect copies are able to be made infinitely, it really makes it more difficult, and Hollywood has obviously been very concerned about pirating, about the difficulties that they have in maintaining copyright of the films that they have so that they don't just all of a sudden start appearing everywhere and people don't have to pay to see them. So technology has really caused the disappearance of those second-run movie theaters, of the standalone art theaters, drive-in theaters in the 1950s. People like to be able to see movies from their cars. Movies are pulled from theaters more quickly now and some go straight to DVD. There are the kinds of things that make a difference in how you can make a movie profitable. One of the bigger differences over the years, I think, in trying to increase the profitability of movies has been that the costs of Hollywood productions are such that they do a lot of research before they release a film. We see a movie like 28 Days Later, and it had a happy ending, kind of, well, as happy as it could be, when the movie was shown in the theaters. That was not the ending that was originally on the film, and it was tested in front of audiences, and many of the audiences said, well, you know, that's a good movie, but boy, it's a little depressing at the end. So the theater owners were concerned that that might depress its overall appeal, and so they demanded, you know, in order to be willing to book the movie, there was a lot of pressure on the movie company that brought the actors back and they shot a happier ending. So some of the movies that you see are not the vision of the director, the auteur, that's the French classy term for a director. Many critics believe that the director is the person who really controls the ultimate quality of the film. So the idea was that you have this auteur, this director who produces this quality film, but then the researchers come in and the marketers come in and they do all these test runs in front of audiences, and the movie ends up getting, from the director's point of view in some cases, kind of butchered just to try to be able to get a movie that's appealing to a broad enough audience to be able to make it financially successful. Now, of course, the digital revolution means that it's much, much easier nowadays for people to produce a low-cost film, to be able to use digital cameras, to be able to not use film, to be able to go out and shoot on their own with cheaper locations, maybe not to use union people on the set as much as Hollywood has been doing. So there are different ways that major studios are facing stiff competition from independent filmmakers as they have more and more access to being able to produce their own movies and show them to a broader public. One of the other things I wanted to talk about is that over time we have become concerned about, or we have started to question, some of the impact of movies on individual behavior. Again, it's that pendulum swinging back and forth. I happen to be good friends with Bob Ressler, who was visiting here at our School of Criminal Justice as a visiting professor for a year. he was, along with John Douglas, the person that created the Behavioral Sciences Unit at Quantico, at the FBI Academy in Quantico. And he interviewed more serial killers than had ever been interviewed before. And he said that America is really, in some ways, with its movies, conducting a strange experiment where we're putting young, vulnerable teenagers in a dark room at night as their hormones are raging, and then showing them a lot of connection between violence and sex. Now, he had concerns that he said, I'm not at all encouraging any kind of censorship, but I think we have to understand that movies have an impact and that they do have an impact on young people, and that we do see that there is a sense that films have to be somewhat responsible for the kinds of information that they're giving to people. What happens with films, too, that I think is interesting as they seek for a more international market in order to try to recoup their costs, is one of the things that you see when you go for an international market is which films tend to do best? Well, action films, right? I mean, if you blow something up, you can blow it up and the language doesn't matter much. The dialogue isn't important as much as it would be in a drama where you really have to understand the nuanced language being used, the different terms. You'd have to understand the culture. An action film, boy, you blow something up, you shoot somebody, you stab somebody, and that's pretty much everybody wants to watch the screen. And it doesn't matter much if it's in one language or another. One of the things we see that depresses movie turnout is if a movie has subtitles or if it's dubbed badly. I mean, they're doing it better and better. But the reality is that a lot of films have that kind of concern that going international, it's easier to do an action film than it is to do a really serious film that has a lot of dialogue. I remember being in Mexico with one of my husbands, and he was unhappy to be there because he missed American culture. So when he found out that there were subtitled movies, he was so excited to go. The only problem was it was a movie in German with subtitles in Spanish, so he still didn't get English. So that will ultimately depress prices. Now, one of the things that I want to do now is be able to encourage you to watch a 20-minute documentary. And it's part of a documentary. It's part of a larger documentary. But it illustrates how I think what we're seeing is a broader appreciation these days of a broader world of film. We are now in a global society in a way that we simply weren't before. We've had some interesting movies, real-life movies that have looking at real people. There's a fictionalized film, for example, one of the only film ever done in Inuit, called Atarwanajat, okay? And it is Fast Runner, and it's a fabulous film. I would encourage you, if you can find it online, to watch that film. But we're able to see into different cultures. We're able to learn about people whose ways of life is totally different than ours. The rise of the documentary has been huge. We are in a state where we have one of the most successful, well, the single most successful documentary filmmaker of all time. We have Michael Moore here. Michael Moore, just as we saw, for example, the rise of the nonfiction book that rivals the novel for sales nowadays, we're seeing the rise of the documentary. It started back in the era where Errol Morris in 1988 did a film called The Thin Blue Line about Randall Adams, who was on death row, almost executed twice. He was innocent. That film grossed more than $1 million in the United States, unheard of for a documentary. Then along comes a year later, Michael Moore with Roger and Me in 1989. It became the 7th highest grossing documentary in the United States, $6.7 million. This is a film that he made by, running bingo games in Flint to make enough money to hire a crew to go out and follow Roger Smith around from General Motors and find out, why are you moving jobs out of Flint to Mexico in the auto industry? And this was, Michael Moore then did Fahrenheit 9/11, did $119 million worth of business. Al Gore did An Inconvenient Truth in 2006, generated $24 million, talking about the impact of climate change. So what we see is the film industry is changing. It's becoming a richer, broader experience, where in addition to feature films that are fictional versions, we're seeing more and more the rise of the documentary. We're seeing the rise of the independent filmmaker who can, because of the lowered barriers to entry to get into the field, afford a digital camera and go out there. I have, beautiful cameras that would have been $100,000 quality a few years ago, and that now I can get for $3,000 or $4,000 to produce films of that quality. I can put them on YouTube. I have 3.3 million hits. People care. We have more outlets, more ways for people to show films directly to the people who want them. And we're also seeing that it is a bigger global audience. So I do want to ask you to watch this 20-minute film. Alison Klayman is an American filmmaker who went to China, and she was fascinated with the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. He's probably the best known international artist in the world right now. And she followed him around for a few years. Very brave man, taking huge political risks and personal risks to be able to tell his point of view. And she did a documentary on him that went a 20-minute version of which a cut-down version was shown on Frontline. And I think it's important to see what a young person who has a passion for filmmaking can do with relatively inexpensive gear, talking somebody into letting them video them, reaching an international audience with an important bit of information, telling us, showing us what another culture is like, showing us what this important artist is doing. Maybe in some ways helping to protect him so that he is less subject, we hope, to government crackdowns on the part of his making of art. He has, since this time, you'll find, suffered some additional problems with trying to rein into house arrest situation with the government. But it is an important film, and what we're finding is that people have more and more opportunities, that even if a Hollywood system is not ready to invest in you and give you millions of dollars to be able to produce a movie, you can, on a shoestring, go out and do an important film and have an impact on the world. So it's a whole new era of filmmaking. We've come an awful long way from the era of those silent shorts. You know, there's an apocryphal story, but I suspect it may be true, that in France, when they first showed the great train robbery, and the train comes pulling into the station, that the people in the audience all went, whoa, because they wanted to duck to make sure the train didn't hit them. Maybe we're a bit more naive back in that era of the silence, where we would see those kinds of films and be able to react to them as if we were there in person. But now what we have is an opportunity to be far more critical about the films we watch, to be discerning consumers. Oh, keep copying you. And to be able to now be our own critics. We can go to Rotten Tomatoes. We can post our own reviews in addition to the professional reviews. The digital world has made it more possible for us to share what we like through word of mouth with our friends. The world of filmmaking is changing dramatically. The opportunities are there for those of you who are thinking about it as a career. It's a remarkable career field, and I will now invite you to watch this film on Ai Weiwei and learn a little bit about his life and realize that we're now part of this whole global audience.